We can see then that during the late Stalinist years of the late 1940s and early 1950s, there was a reversal of Soviet policy toward Israel, from one which viewed Israel as an anti-imperial and anti-fascist ally, to one which saw it as an imperial force hell-bent on the destruction of communism. In direct relation to this, the Soviets under Stalin also unleashed a series of anti-cosmopolitan purges. Though starting off as a wider attack on elements deemed as a threat to Soviet patriotism, these purges quickly turned into a thinly veiled, fierce anti-Semitic campaign that targeted mainly Jewish communists, falsely accusing them of promoting Zionism. Jewish writers, politicians, scientists, and intellectuals were arrested and executed. Particularly remembered is the infamous Doctors' Plot, a modern-day blood libel in which a group of prominent Moscow doctors, predominantly Jews, were accused of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders. Throughout this onslaught, the Soviets were careful not to overtly state that they were targeting Jews, all the while claiming it was an attempt to purge the Soviet Union of harmful Zionist and bourgeois nationalist elements. Taking the Soviet perceptions and actions that emerged during these years into consideration, let's now return to the form and content of the Soviet anti-Zionism of the late Stalinist years, better clarifying its historical importance to the development of contemporary far-left anti-Zionism.
Now, when the Cold War solidified, broke out, 1948-9, the Soviet Union changed its policy in the course of the anti-cosmopolitan purges in Europe. Rather than view Zionism and the State of Israel as part of the history of anti-fascism, Stalin now began to view Zionism as part of the Western imperialist conspiracy directed against the Soviet Union. The communists performed a historical act of great importance. Nobody in the world would have paid any attention to ex-Nazis who made the case that Zionism was a form of racism, or Zionism was a form of aggression, or Zionism was a form of colonialism. If a bunch of ex-Nazis had made these arguments, people would have said, that's just the nonsense you said during World War II. Nobody cares what you said. You're a bunch of criminals. We don't care anything. You're out. You're finished. What the communists did, what the Soviet Union accomplished from 1949 to 1956, was to redefine the meaning of anti-fascism, to lend the moral and political prestige of the war against Nazi Germany to the attack on the State of Israel. This was not something that any ex-Nazi could have done. And so it was a remarkable accomplishment on the part of the communists. Now, anti-Zionism was somehow associated with trying to build a better world and struggle against colonialism and imperialism, rise up against American imperialism. So the Soviet Union and Stalin brought that change about.
The extreme Soviet anti-Zionist campaign and the Soviet military support for the Arab states intensified during and after the Six-Day War that took place in June 1967. This brief war ended with Israel's decisive victory, which included the capture of the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The Israeli control of these territories and their Palestinian residents would subsequently become a major point of contention in the Arab-Israeli conflict, while Sinai would eventually return to Egypt following the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty of 1977, and in 2005, Israel would disengage from Gaza Strip and North Samaria in the West Bank. The Soviet Union played a key role in the escalating tensions in the Middle East in the 1960s, backing Arab armies and countries in an attempt to gain a foothold in the region as part of the power struggle of the Cold War. Israel's swift victory deeply encroached on Soviet aspirations. It subsequently broke off diplomatic ties with the Israeli state and began a full-blown vitriolic anti-Zionist and anti-Israeli campaign characterized by clear anti-Semitic imagery and rhetoric.
The Soviets took side 100% with the Arab population, for example, in 1967, and published an immense number of anti-Zionist propaganda in the context of this war and the years that followed this war, and even the years before the war, actually, in which they identified in the literature Jews, well, not Jews, Zionists with fascism. And you have many caricatures that were very widespread in the Soviet Union in publications such as Krokodil, which was very widespread at the time of Moshe Dayan, for example, who is depicted as Hitler or is depicted as Hitler's ally. So that you have Zionism that is turned into fascism, that is turned into Nazism. And I do believe that this plays an important role in the left, in the European left, in this, in legitimizing a discourse that is a one-sided discourse that demonizes Zionism as fascism, regardless of, you know, the various political views of the person who's making this argument. But you do have this nexus that is facilitated by the Soviets. You know, besides the fact that the Soviets were also very active in training PLO, members of the PLO, and but as far as literature goes, as far as propaganda, as far as the message that the Soviet Union, Soviet communism is conveying to European communism and the European left, I do believe that that it facilitated this the identification of Zionism with fascism.
The Soviet form of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism was not limited to the Soviet Union alone. We will see later how it seeped into the Western radical left, strongly influencing and shaping its perception of Israel. It also spread across the Soviet bloc states, the communist nations closely allied with the Soviet Union. The extreme anti-Israel and anti-Zionist stance took a particularly predominant role in the communist dictatorship of East Germany. In 1949, following the end of the Second World War and the solidification of the Cold War, Germany was divided into two separate states, the non-communist Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, and the Communist German Democratic Republic, or East Germany.
The leaders of the Federal Republic of Germany, especially Konrad Adenauer, but also a man named Theodor Heuss and a social democrat named Kurt Schumacher, argued that in order for this new Germany to convince the world that there was another Germany, that something had changed, that this Germany needed to help the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, that it needed to give some kind of restitution payments to this new state of Israel, and to do no more harm to the Jews. The Germans hadn't turned into angels overnight, but the famous slogan of the medical profession, "Do no more harm," is one way of summarizing West Germany's policies towards Israel after the Second World War. Just do no more harm. If you can do some good, that's all very nice, but at a minimum, don't do any more harm. The East Germans interpreted the meaning of overcoming Nazism very differently excuse me, than did the West Germans. Their argument was that the primary victim of the Second World War was the Soviet Union, and that the Jews were among many, many people in Europe who had been victimized by the Nazis. The Jews, the Zionists, were rather selfish in their view. Why should people pay so much attention to these 6 million Jews who were murdered when there were 25 million soldiers and civilians of the Soviet Union who died in the Second World War, and 3 million non-Jewish Poles and millions of others, and on and on. What was so special about the Jews? They're so selfish, the Jews. And anyway, the main cause of Nazism was not ideological anti-Semitism, though that's bad enough. It was capitalism. So please spare us these marvelous speeches about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, because really the only thing that matters is whether or not you get rid of capitalism. If you leave capitalism intact, then all the bastards and all the criminals are still there, and save us the very moving speeches at Bergen-Belsen. East Germany was 17 million people, it was much smaller than the Soviet Union. And yet, the interesting thing about the history of East Germany is not only that it never had diplomatic relations with Israel, but that it became a huge fan of the Arab states at war with Israel and of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And in the 1960s and 1970s and 80s became a base for training and money and arms shipments and weapons deliveries to Hafez al-Assad's Syria, first Nasser's Egypt, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Omar Gaddafi's Libya, as well as the Palestine Liberation Organization, including its militant organizations, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The interesting aspect of this is that we have a German state after the Nazis, which, of course, did not actually send its soldiers to war with Israel. It did not engage in a Holocaust or a genocide. Nobody is suggesting that. But did do more harm to the Jews. I think in the long history of anti-Semitism, the era of the Cold War and the era of communist anti-Semitism and then the era of leftist anti-Semitism since then is unique. Unique because at the same time that these states were arming the states and movements that were attacking the Jewish citizens of Israel, and the non-Jewish citizens of Israel as well, the citizens of Israel. In other words, the same time that they were doing things that actually harmed living Jews, they insisted they had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. This hadn't been the case before. Previously, when anti-Semites attacked Jews, they said, we attack Jews because they're Jews, because we don't like Jews. This is I think that's one of the one of the defining features of secular leftist and communist anti-Zionism. One West German leftist leader said the very accusation that attacks on Israel had anything to do with anti-Semitism was what he said was, in his words, an old Zionist trick.